um, perhaps one way we could go about this tonight to ask, first of all, questions or remarks about the Foucault readings that we've done, including this last two lectures of The Birth of Biopolitics, and then, of course, the last lecture of Society Must Be Defended. And any thoughts about that before we go into, I think, something that's, highly critical and highly open-ended for criticism and use, both in Giorgio Agamben's work. I do want to mention that Homo Sacer, the book that you have, in the PDF form or the actual text, is just the first volume of 9 volumes. This is a series he's done. And for those of you interested, again, the series, the second book is State of Exception that Patrick said he had. Then the third, there's two, and he does it in propositional form. 2.1 is State of Exception. 2.2 is Stasis, Civil War as a political paradigm. The Greek word stasis means civil war. When we say something is static or it's in stasis, we're basically using the term civil war as the Greeks had used it. 2.3 is the Sacrament of Language, an archaeology of the oath, which I think Marxism and comradeship could certainly learn from, but it's more about the Roman Catholic Church. The Kingdom and the Glory is 2.4, so you get beginning of the drift here. For a theological genealogy of economy and giving. Then finally, in the 2.1 series, Opus Dei, an archaeology of duty. So we go from, the oath, the genealogy of economy and giving, and to that of duty. And then 3 is Remnants of Auschwitz, which I think is, certainly prevalent for today in many ways. Witness and Archive. One way of rereading the archive in a Foucaultian sense. I recommend that one. I mean, I've looked at it. It's impressive. 4.1, and I have not read all 9, I admit. I've read, I think, 3 or 4 of these. The Higher Poverty, and this is the monastic rules and form of life with hyphens, and ending with 4.2, the use of bodies. So this is the 9 volume of a 20-year project that he has done in terms of what I would call exercises in, political theology, much more advanced than Carl Schmitt's work, and certainly a new turn, if you will, from that of, if you want to divide this into movements, on the one hand, you have Derrida wrote Acts of Religion. Nancy, Jean-Luc Nancy, Bruno's not here, but he was in classes with Jean-Luc Nancy in Paris. The Inoperative Community, and the Agamben's own The Coming Community, right, as all being moments here. And this is juxtaposed, if you will, to the Tony Negre workers' power, right, movements, the autonomia movements. And I talked about this last week, that Foucault is lecturing at the Collège de France, and then at the École Normale, Negre is giving lectures on the Grundrisse. So these are 2 different paths of thinking that go. Sometimes they meet, certainly Foucault and Marx and Foucault and Negre had connections, and Foucault is very operative in the Negre and Hart book, Empire, just to give, again, some background here. But on the other hand, this is a different strategy post-May of 68, which to me, or May of 68 in the aftermath, which has its culminating periods in Society of the Spectacle of Debord, of course, Sartre's Critique of Dialectical Reason, and in my estimation, of course, the Anti-Oedipus, and the Lacanian seminars as well. But this is going beyond that. So we will struggle with this, because in some ways I want to speak about, I'll read a little bit from the introduction tonight and see what the stakes are for Agamben, and then go on to the reading for tonight, and I guess next week as well, the camp, part 3, the campus biopolitical paradigm of the modern, and maybe see if this is applicable to today what does it mean, to say it's an open camp in Gaza? What does that mean, in the Agamben's language? And is this where some of this is coming from in terms of the modern? And then the whole notion of threshold, which I think is very important as well. And I'll maybe point to some other parts of the book that I found interesting. Again, I'll let Arto speak to some of the objections here as well, how he goes about it, because he obviously comes much more out of the Arendtian notion of totalitarianism, which has been taken up on both sides of the equation, the fascism on the, and of course the gulags that I mentioned last week. But maybe we can start again with if you will, the Foucault, if there are questions or responses or any kind of issues that you'd like to present, questions about the Foucault reading. Again, these are seminal lectures. I mean, they started a whole new field that is now in some academic departments called the biopolitical. And I think he's excellent in the last section, the last chapter. We were talking about last time, the Adam Ferguson and the notion of civil society. And then, of course, I went back, and again, I recommend, if you have history of sexuality, I know this was a rage item and for a little while. The first volume has the last chapter of this, which is entitled, it's after the deployment of sexuality, which is called The Right of Death and Power over life. So, another thing in which he goes through what I would, loosely call the political technology of the body as a general heading as we go forward. Okay, and then of course, going back to where he begins to articulate what the biopolitical is, what a study will look like, and this is in the 1976 lecture of March of 17th. On biological racism, but I thought Arto did a great job of covering that, and a lot of the relationships, of course, to what we know of Italian fascism, and then of course even more so of the Nazi state. So anyway, I'll open it up to the floor, and then we can go on if there are any comments. Or Arto, feel free to as well. Yeah. I mean, feel free to criticize these guys. They're not sacred cows, Maybe, Homo Sacer, but not sacred cows.
No, I mean, just as an initial point, I just felt like, I mean, it's interesting. It's very, it's clearly very rich writing, but I think Agamben still stays very much in this language of, political philosophy, the sovereign, the nation state. And whereas I think if we take somebody like, Chapoutot, freedom to obey, this would be an interesting conversation with Agamben. What is Agamben's notion of racism, as practiced by the Nazis, for example, versus Chapoutot's approach that we read about the core of Nazi thinking about the political? And are there differences, in the reading? And I found Chapoutot's, just as an initial comment, I found Chapoutot's understanding of the Nazi ideology much more revealing and much more important, much more useful politically, because it's a much more, it shows how Nazism is much closer to liberalism, how it's deeply infused by it. And in many ways, Agamben's politics remain within the orbit of liberalism. And that's probably what Heidegger would have said about him, I'm guessing. He would have called him a liberal as an insult, as sort of like the limits to his thought, I don't know. But I also think it's interesting to compare maybe what Foursov would say to Agamben's notion of like sovereignty as simply a myth, and Foursov would say that the nation state as it exists in liberal societies is not the ultimate arbiter. It's actually doubtful whether it has control over life or power over life, as Foucault might say. The biopolitical is actually much more directly wielded through non-sovereign spaces in society. It's much more, our dependency on Google and Facebook and social media platforms and etc. is much more, our daily life perhaps is much more under the management of biopolitics as exercised by Zuckerberg's corporation. I mean, he's the figurehead, but by Meta Corporation than it is by the United States government. So I think I don't know. I think I'm not an expert on Agamben, but sort of reading him now gave me the sense that he's still in this orbit of the public and the private and the sovereign and the liberal notions of the nation state and sort of the refugee and etc. So it's interesting. It's interesting, but I kind of feel like it's maybe less. I don't know how much of an improvement it is in terms of the insight gained compared to Foucault or that we read. But I'm not sure what I'm saying makes any sense.
Maybe if I could, I'll go to the introduction. I think everybody has a good PDF of the edition. It should have it. I think it was sent out, and if not, the book is available. I'm reading from the book, which is very marked up in many ways, a lot of questions, etc. But if I could turn to page 11 of and maybe address what Arto's speaking to. Page 11 of the introduction, which we did not assign, but I think it's important for the discussion to move forward. Carl Schmitt's definition of sovereignty: the sovereign is he who decides on the state of exception. And we can take this phrase, we're not reading this, but this is certainly something that he sees common. Yeah. And of course, state of exception was used post 9/11. And remember, this is, by the way, for Agamben, his contribution to post 9/11 in a way. This is when this project started, and by the way, he would not, after the Patriot Act was done, he would not come to the United States. He refused. He was invited to give talks, very substantial salaries. He would not enter the United States, refused to, because of the Patriot Act. Okay, so anyway, it became a commonplace even before there was any understanding that what was at issue in it was nothing less than the limit concept of the doctrine of law, right, and the state, in which sovereignty, borders, since every limit concept is always the limit between two concepts, that is on the sphere of life and becomes indistinguishable from it. And as long as the form of the state constituted the fundamental horizon of all communal life, and the political, religious, juridical, and economic doctrines to sustain this form were still strong, this most extreme sphere, and quote unquote, could not truly come to light. The problem of sovereignty was reduced to the question of who within the political order was invested with certain powers, and the very threshold of the political order itself was never called into question. And I think, Firsthoff is doing that in his way, calling the entire political order into question. Today, now that the great state structures have entered into a process of dissolution, and the emergency has, as Benjamin foresaw, become the rule, the time is ripe to place the problem of the originary structure and limits of the form of the state into a new perspective. The weakness of anarchist and Marxist critiques of the state was precisely to have not caught sight of this structure, and thus to have quickly left the imperial arcanum aside, as if it had no substance outside of the simulacra and the ideologies invoked to justify it. But one ends up identifying with an enemy whose structure one does not understand, and the theory of the state, and in particular of the state of exception, which is to say, of the dictator of the proletariat as a transitional phase leading to the stateless society, is the reef on which the revolutions of our century have been shipwrecked. So yes, there's obviously a moment against Lenin here, and trying to think this through. This book, which was originally conceived as a response to the bloody mystification of the new planetary order, and you could say this is the project for the new American century that we're still living through. It's being defended viciously now, as we all know, therefore had to reckon with problems. First of all, that of the sacredness of life, the first problem, which the author had not in the beginning foreseen. In the course of the undertaking, however, it became clear that one cannot, in such an area, accept as a guarantee any of the notions that the social sciences, from jurisprudence to anthropology, thought they had defined or presupposed as evident, and in many of these notions demanded, in the urgency of catastrophe, to be revised without reserve. So I wanted to, maybe begin there. I mean, to my mind, what Agamben, I think, is saying that the tools of historical materialism, right, and the anarchist tradition are not enough to really understand this new manifestation, if you will, or new, the originary structure of this sovereign, or this sovereign state, in a sense, and that he sees a kind of wreckage, if you will, along the way up until his time. Now, remember, this is the first volume of a very long project, and obviously developed. I don't think he mapped it in the beginning, but this is a very, very long project that he had in mind. So anyway, I mean, for me, what I take from this is that he does in some ways want to throw into question the method of historical materialism, in terms of understanding the movement of history. And he wants to look at this through a kind of different lens, by using Foucaultian genealogy, Heideggerian hermeneutics that we'll see, and also reading the law, in the archive and how that works alongside, Imperium Roman and into today. So anyway, I mean, any thoughts about this, or any kind of comments about what Agamben's up to? And again, as I mentioned, this is one direction that's taken, if you will, against the group, of Marxists around Negre in Europe, the empire, or even before autonomy. It's within, the Derridian project of a kind of return to the understanding of how much political theology still infuses politics in some ways, and also, I think it's also about, the Agamben, the inability to form, and I think that this is very much on Arto's line of that the impossibility of having a political community that liberalism does not allow us to. So the inoperative community is another thing that could work both ways here, the notion of the inoperative. So maybe we could begin there. I mean, since there's a lot of question. He's obviously, I pulled out The Origins of Totalitarianism, which has a whole section on anti-Semitism, if anybody's interested in revisiting this. I forgot how much he did on anti-Semitism and the rise of, since this is part of the conversation, Arendt's book that was, taken up as the Bible for the talk about totalitarianism. But as Arto pointed out, she admired Stalin. She never went out and
And I can just add the quote
yeah,
here.
sure.
1945.
Yes.
Hannah Arendt writes on this is from Losurdo's new book, newly translated book on Stalin, which is kind of like the only book in English after Isaac Deutscher's classic great work on Trotsky and Stalin that tries to make sense of the Soviet political system in its most revolutionary phase. So Hannah Arendt writes in 1945 that the country led by Stalin had distinguished itself for, quote, its entirely new and successful approach to nationality conflicts, its new form of organizing different peoples on the basis of national equality. It was sort of a model, something to which every political and national movement should give its utmost attention. Which, I mean, people can change their minds, of course, but can people really change their minds that much? Those makes me a little bit, it's an interesting quote that Hannah Arendt would say that, and then later would say something totally different, which is interesting, like
Right.
what caused the change of heart,
Right. And that's 1945 after the war.
That's 1945, yeah.
45, right. And the Origins of Totalitarianism is published in 1950, but she's obviously working on it,
Yeah.
I mean, in her head way before. And I just, give me 1 second because of course this stuff gets me going. She has literally at least 30 references to Stalin in this book, right? In a sense, and I'll try to go over those too, et cetera, for next time, and yeah, I mean,
by the way, there's a great quote. I don't want to keep staying on this vector, but just in terms of,
no,
Thomas Mann apparently said, this question of totalitarianism, but also the equivocation of, Nazism with Soviet communism, Soviet style socialism. So Thomas Mann writes this in the 1950s, early 50s. He says to place Russian communism and Nazi fascism on the same moral plane, in that both would be totalitarian. So he's directly responding to Agamben too. I mean, obviously long before Agamben wrote this, but so to place Russian communism and Nazi fascism on the same moral plane, that they both would be totalitarian, is superficial at best, fascism at worst. Whoever insists on this equation may well consider himself a Democrat. In truth, and in the bottom of his heart, he is in fact already a fascist, and certainly only in a hypocritical and insincere way will he fight fascism while reserving all of his hatred for communism. It's extraordinary insight on what's happening by the great writer, of course. And the great writers, in many ways, the great writers, it seems, I mean, Michael, you've said this many times too, and maybe this is why Aronowitz always implored us to read novels, to read fiction, to read poetry. The great writers really understand the political many times far more insightfully than the major philosophers and the great philosophers. I think Thomas Mann's, that's the most powerful, I think, succinct rebuttal of the notion that those two political systems were totalitarian, two sides of the same coin. But basically saying, if you believe that, you're going to fight fascism only half-heartedly. Which, I mean, it's perfectly captures the liberal double-facedness. You're going to be a hypocritical and insincere in your way to fight fascism while reserving all of your hatred for the counter-capitalist project, which is exactly the time we're living through with the resuscitation of the neo-Nazis in Ukraine by the liberals, by the West, by the European Union and the United States government. The ruling classes of those societies are staying quiet and actively encouraging the resuscitation of neo-Nazism in certain parts of the world in order to further their politics. But is it really instrumental use of neo-Nazi resuscitation, or is it that's their true essence? And Thomas Mann is basically saying, these people are trash. These people are the real enemy of progress. I mean, it's I don't know. I just found that to be very interesting in terms of the use of the word totalitarianism.
and also someone who came from a highly politicized family. I mean, the family themselves were senators in Germany before.
Oh, really?
Yes, they came from a very, very high-powered, very well-positioned family. The three Mons and the three writers. There was not
Right.
just one. There were three things. I'm
Right.
sorry, that's Amazon delivering a book, so that was the bell in the background. Sorry. Yeah.
And it's particularly interesting from Thomas Mann because he was not a communist militant. I mean,
He wrote a book, Confessions of an Apolitical Man. Yeah,
right,
yeah, which is
right.
very, very
But it
important.
just shows this incredible, I don't know, insight. But anyways, yeah.
No, no, it's
So
very good. I mean, speaking of Mon too, again, someone that's not read and talked about actively, but of course, the Magic Mountain really captures the spirit in between, the early parts of Weimar into the Nazi dictatorship, if you will, or the beginning of the Nazi state, and the great discussions between the characters Nafta and Settembrini, which, if you read between the lines and you think it through, it's a conversation between Georgio Lukács and Martin Heidegger. He's very well aware of this, and he reconstructs this beautifully. And then later, of course, the Buddenbrooks, which is the family, the great family novel, Death in Venice, another great novel. And then, of course, the Dr. Faustus, which is the story of Arnold Schoenberg mixed with Friedrich Nietzsche, which is very interesting in the character of Adrian Louverkuhn and Serenius Seidblum, and which he consulted with Adorno. So Mann knew a lot about dissonance, dissent, and politics beyond that of just being, quote, the apolitical man who ended up in Pacific Palisades, California during the war, and then some lectures here in New York at City College. By the way, he did give lectures at City College back in the day when it was still a college. Patrick, yeah.
Yeah, I mean, he was also part of the group around Brecht and Adorno,
Yes.
Horkheimer, Marcuse in LA,
Yes.
and they were meeting regularly. And I think a lot of this comment is coming. I was taken with the reference to Benjamin.
Yes.
Because I mean, the critique of violence and the argument that he makes, and that is very similar to the one that Agamben has.
Great connection. Yeah.
And it is, I mean, if we take it, I mean, yeah, Agamben maybe express this kind of reference to Marxism, but I think is often the case, it depends on which Marxism you're talking about.
Absolutely.
And he is really articulating a theory which I think kind of undergirds the notion of original accumulation and the way in which the polity within capitalist society has its origin in this element of violence, to use Benjamin's term,
right.
But also the state of exception, that it essentially founds, you know, the logic of this society. So I think you have to take the references to Marxism with a grain of salt. And anyway.
Well, you know, it's like most of the Europeans that were educated at a certain point. You know, they know their Marx cold, right? They got this from day one in the schools in some ways, and they're always trying to look for little angles to get out of that, you know, that this is the model of models. But at the same time, yes, you're absolutely right. He's retaining an enormous amount of Marx here. And yes, and was, you know, very much, yeah. And I love what you're talking about because in a sense, this book could be also read, as you suggested, Patrick, as a theory of divine violence. You know, what is divine violence? As in Benjamin, you could really think of that Homo Sacer as the Homo of divine violence, right? And he goes through these strategies in the critique of violence. Sorry, we did not sign that, but it would be a great supplement to this. Yeah, his work. Yeah, it's a great connection. Yeah, to my mind. Yeah, and you're right. I mean, they all hung out together. You know, Brecht didn't like Adorno, and vice versa. They couldn't stand each other. You know, Mann, you know, who had the kind of tongue in cheek about Adorno. You know, I've heard all the stories. And then, of course, you had the great psychoanalyst Otto Fenichel, who was the round table out there. Very interesting character. You know, who was watched very carefully by the government. But he had the round table. The left Freudian movement is kind of founded in that group, you know, and this is where Adorno and others got some of their psychoanalysis from Fenichel. Yeah, from Otto Fenichel. Yeah. So very interesting moment in history. I don't know, Arto, you want to go? I mean, I thought Patrick did a great job of, you know, kind of displacing the more linear approach with you know, making those connections to the critique of violence. Of Benjamin, because I think that's a very good starting point. You know, because you know, in a way, Heidegger, you know, polemos, you know, the originary moment of violence, etc., what people try to shy away from. I know I've mentioned Ernst Cassirer here again, that Cassirer could not stare the abyss in the face, whereas Heidegger could, you know, the so-called thing in itself, you know, and the Davos meeting, of course, Davos being the place of where the Magic Mountain was, and today the place they go to for, you know, these stupid finance capital meetings. So yeah, anyway, you know, we need William Gaddis to rewrite Davos for us, you know, how much we've deteriorated from Naft Settembrini, and I think her name was Natasha, right? The woman from the yeah, Natasha and Claudia. I forgot the name of the Russian woman who seduces Hans Kastorf. You know, the initiation into the world of ideas. Yeah. Anyway, it's a great novel. I mean, you know, it's got, you know, it's incredible the learning that went into that work. Yeah. So.
Natalie, maybe.
Yeah, no, I don't think it's Natalie. No. Either, yeah, I forgot, but yeah. I
But she
think it
was
was
she was
Paul.
offended.
I wrote a paper on it many moons ago. I can't remember. I remember speaking highly of her in the paper.
She was offended by the hard closing of a door.
I see. Okay. Okay. Yeah. Well, as Arto started this with giving us the novelists as those who intuit. As Freud used to say, before the poets, we lay down our arms. Right? Psychoanalysis has no weapons against the poet's intuition and the poet's insights. So, and I think the same can be true of some of the political explorations of the novelists. Right? I mean, you can read Ulysses as the end of liberal capitalism. All of time is compressed into one day, 24 hours, and an average man's life in Dublin, Ireland, right? Yeah. Leopold Bloom becomes kind of exemplary of liberal capitalism. It's the end of liberal capitalism right there. And that's 100 years ago. We're still playing out this farce, right, in different ways. But I think, Arto, I want to just say I don't find Agamben liberal. I don't think he's an apologist, nor does he fall into liberal traps. I think there are traps here, and he uses and he marshals certain kind of evidence that hits our or scars our collective consciousness, if you will, in a sense, or gets us on guard. But at the same time, I don't think this is a plea for any kind of liberalism. I think it's just as much against liberalism as any other stuff we read. It's a different approach, and he is taking up a kind of, the reason I mentioned divine violence, it's a political theology in a way. This is something that, we don't really get so much of in the Marxist tradition, Now, I'm not making a case for it, but I think we should be aware of it, that this is where he's coming from. Yeah. Yeah. And he's a strange mix. I mean, he's an incredible amount of knowledge here. You obviously see the ability with legal texts, and as an interpreter of legal texts, he knows the juridical extremely well. It's almost an adjective a page is juridical, right? In a way, and he's really playing out. I think the interesting thing here is again how life and politics merge. How this chapter, the first chapter of the camp, as biopolitical paradigm of the modern, how life becomes politicized, right? The bureaucratization of life, the state being involved in life. And he's really trying to go through this. And I think what he really adds to the tradition, as Foucault does, is the notion of the body. Yeah, this is what he really brings to the table. And I thought the little, I don't know if you guys had a chance to read it or read it in depth, but he begins with a habeas corpus, with corpus, right? And the body here, right? In history. Yeah. 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 So again, I'm very interested. I mean, I think we should be in terms of Overland Adam is the whole new notion of you, if you will, this notion of the politicization of life. How this is occurring and how it's become a political technology, if you will. And I emphasize the technology there of the body. What's happening.
Well, this is interesting, and if we can speculate for a second. So, for example, speaking of the politicization of the body and where it might be going next. So yesterday, I was just reading some news, and there was a story about how, obviously it was about artificial intelligence because that's the new kind of capital accumulation growth spurred by the introduction of this next evolution of like cybernetic insights or technology. So the article said that Microsoft had just released this new product, which was the result of their acquisition of some startups a couple of years ago. And there was a demo page, and you could go and try this new artificial intelligence software. And what it does is it allows a person, or another machine to create any sound that they can express in text or their own voice. or somebody else's voice. So basically, you go to your computer and you go to this site, and there's a text box, and you say, there was a young woman walking on a dark street in Brooklyn, coming home from college. Her classes at Brooklyn College. When she approached, the G stop on this street, then she heard the faraway rumble of the subway, and you hit enter. And what the software does is it converts the textual description, into voice and into sound. So basically, you have a radio show or a podcast. So you just type a bunch of text, right? You can be as creative, a story or whatever. And then 3 seconds later, you hear a woman's voice narrating this, or a man's voice, or whatever, what you just wrote in text. And then you hear at the appropriate moment, you hear synthesize the sound of a subway train, rumbling away. And then there's thunder and starts, or you can record your own voice. And then you can you can do the reverse. You record your own voice, and then you type in the text box a sentence. I'm now going to read the first opening pages of Agamben's Homo Sacer, and then you start reading. So what the software does is it uses your voice, and it starts reading in your voice things that you didn't say, but that sounds like you, right? So okay, so you can see the immediate applications of this new technological breakthrough. You can synthesize college lectures, right? You can create new Michael Peliases that sound like Michael Pelias and kind of deliver lectures in Heidegger or Agamben, virtually to students. 3 million people listening on the virtual, intro to philosophy class. So you can imagine all these applications, but then the question becomes, what does that do to the politicization? What does that do in the context of capitalist political economy and the question of the political? That use of the body, right? Like when your own voice is no longer necessarily yours, or when you can become a musician without knowing anything about music. You can write music from now on without knowing anything about music. You can write a novel or a short story without actually writing it. You can become a filmmaker without knowing anything about film, in terms of as a form of art, right? The technique is now been completely solved and potentially, if you want, detached from the body, from the being itself, right? Because you can basically tell the computer, generate 3 minutes of music in the style of John Coltrane, late period. Except it's performed on a harp, a Scottish harp. And you're gonna get kind of believable bebop played on the harp without the person who is giving the command doing anything about it. So what happens now in terms of the techne, or all these questions that are now we're being confronted with? I mean, obviously, without being Luddites and without saying, well, we shouldn't use the computer that way, because it's going to be used by the capitalists. Or how is it going to be used by the capitalists? Perhaps the proportion of surplus workers is going to increase exponentially. That's the obvious suggestion. Generalized proletarianization is going to deepen, because now you're going to have an entire subset of college professors who are going to be made obsolete in 10 years, or lawyers, or MRI CAT scan readers, and etc. But what does it do if we stay in Agamben's vocabulary? What does it do on the question of how is life being politicized? Beyond the obvious immediate answer, which is it's becoming surplus very rapidly for increasingly larger and larger parts of the proletariat. In other words, what happens beyond generalized proletarianization? One immediate answer is the transformation of the meaning of the word citizen or political subjectivity into simply usage structures. People as usage structures, or economic activity, not through what was the title of Jean-Francois Lyotard's great book that was a response to capitalism and schizophrenia? libidinal economy. So what is the next stage beyond a citizen today, not a life of consumption, living not a life of consumption or life of their satisfying their libidinal needs, but simply using artificial intelligence programs which are functioning as digital social objects, because they're no longer just digital technological objects. They have increasingly social functions, right? Social functions that are blurring the line between human and machine, if we want to use that Wiener or Weiner language. So the blurring of the line between human and the machine, which we're living through right now and we're going to be living through moving forward, raises interesting questions that I think Agamben is anticipating, right? In a sense, just like Foucault was anticipating as well. But they don't have the answers because,
as was Marx, in terms of the critique of mechanical materialism during his own time with the man as a machine, of course, and the attacks on Lemaitre in particular, right? And the French materialism, how far he took that. And one of the reasons I think Marx, in a way, wrote the thesis on Feuerbach is to begin to bring back a kind of real organicity to the question of materialism, rather than, and then later, of course, the notebooks of the Grundrisse were the section, the great fragment on machines, which I like very much, and, actually, produced the book, The Jobless Future of Aronowitz and Devasio, a reading of those 30 pages.
Yeah. And I mean, this is interesting in the sense that, I mean, if we think about it in very kind of boring, concrete ways, I mean, so if we sit down and use these software things that are going to become ubiquitous everywhere within the next 5 years, right? What does that give us that we don't have today, right? So in other words, what's the next? I mean, I can sit down and write, 5 pages of text, and I could have, within 5 seconds, I could have a narration. So I guess it'll speed up the production of value or speed up the production of commodities. So in other words, how is that different than the invention of the typewriter, the record player, which substituted live music and brought it into the living room? How is this new technology, this digital social objects, how are they different from any other technological breakthrough that increased alienation, perhaps, or sped up work in the production of commodities? I mean, does it still make sense to even talk about the production of commodities? Is that really where these latest developments are going? Is it still the commodification of what human knowledge or have we gone beyond that? Right. So these are some of the interesting questions that I was thinking of when I was reading this
So
notion
we would
of
reread Capital, make a new volume 1, if you would, or a volume 4 instead of the theories of surplus value, and we would begin with derivatives and digital social objects.
Right. Or if we say,
That's
if we
fair enough
literally
to say that a new circuits of capital are being created here. And
yeah. And also the very beginning of Capital Volume 1, when Marx says, the wealth of societies that are capitalist presents itself to people as the giant, collection of commodities. Right. That's not the real fundamental relationship, but that's the one that's the most immediately accessible to everybody, right? Because, right, Capital Volume 1, the beginning, Marx says an entry point into understanding capitalist society, we can do it from the abstract to the concrete. The most abstract, most immediate, most easily perceivable part of our society that's capitalist, he said, is to understanding that everything is commodified, or almost everything that is of use to us is only obtainable through money. Right? This special commodity and etc. And then he proceeds from this abstract kind of most easily perceivable that everybody understands that we live in a world of commodities to the increasingly kind of more fundamental and thus more power infused relationships, of which the relationship of the capital and capital accumulation and through the extraction of surplus labor and etc. etc. So what would be that today? What does the wealth of late capitalist or early post or hyper capitalist societies presents itself to us? Is it still as the collection of commodities, or is it through something else? That could be that's an interesting question, I think, that is worth thinking about. Maybe the answer is yes, it's still commodities. Perhaps even greater volume of commodities or whatever, but maybe not. And how is life politicized? I mean, right? So that's to go back to Agamben.
You know, maybe one way of going about Agamben, I know I'm making a giant step here, but maybe one way of looking and reading Agamben that might be productive would to kind of do it teleological, where we begin at the end in this chapter called Threshold, where he summarizes the book and, you know, gives a very good sense of everything going on. So he says, and this is on page 181, it was part of the reading for today. He says three theses have emerged as provisional conclusions, and, you know, again, in the course of this inquiry. The original political relation is the ban. And he has a very interesting chapter. We didn't assign it, but for those of you interested, on the notion of abandonment, and where the ban, which is the state of exception, is a zone. The ban is a zone of indistinction between outside and inside, exclusion and inclusion. Number one, that preliminary provisional thesis, conclusion, I'm sorry. Two, the fundamental activity of sovereign power, and I emphasize sovereign power, is the production of bare life, again, as an originary political element, and the politicization of life itself, right? And as a threshold of an articulation between nature and culture, the old Greek, you know, physis, nomos, and zoe and bios, right? The animal life and the biological life. Three, today it is not the city, and again, this is where he ends and where this part three, where we're actually beginning tonight, but rather the camp that is the fundamental biopolitical paradigm of the West. So he goes through this. The first calls into question every theory, and this is interesting to me, every contractual origin of the state. Yeah, every contractual origin of the state, and along with it, every attempt to ground political communities in something like belonging. So this is a question we could certainly raise, whether it be found on popular, national, religious, or any other identity. So the question of the identity of the community, what is it grounded on, etc. The second thesis implies that Western politics is a biopolitics from its very beginning, and that every attempt to found political liberties and the right of a citizen is therefore in vain. Which is interesting. This whole thing about rights. Yeah, this to me is a radical thought. I mean, I'm not saying we have to agree with it, but we should follow it through in some ways, work it through. The third thesis throws a sinister light on the models of which the social sciences, you know, sociology, urban studies, architecture today are trying to conceive and organize the public space of the world's cities without any clear awareness that at their very center lies the same bare life. And I was reminded here of Mike Davis's Planet of Slums, if any of you have read that, a very good empirical study. Even if it has been transformed and rendered apparently more human, that define the biopolitics of the great totalitarian states of the 20th century. Whatever, you know, we can critique that, but again, this interesting notion of the same bare life that was happening in the camps. We can maybe leave it at that, right, in some ways, and in terms of the concentration. So in the syntagm, bare life, bare corresponds to the Greek hoplos, the term by which first philosophy defines pure being, the hoplos, right? That isolation of the sphere of pure being, which constitutes the fundamental activity of Western metaphysics, is now within analogies with the isolation of bare life in the realm of Western politics. What constitutes man as a thinking animal has its exact counterpart in what constitutes him as a political animal. In the first case, the problem is to isolate pure being from the many meanings of the term being, which according to Aristotle is said in many ways, right? And in the second, what is at stake is the separation of bare life from the many forms of concrete life. Pure being, bare life, what is contained in these two concepts, such that both the metaphysics and the politics of the West find their foundation and sense in them and them alone. But is it found there? He's throwing up a question. What is the link between the two constitutive processes by which metaphysics and politics seem, in isolating their proper elements, simultaneously to run up against an unthinkable limit? For bare life is certainly as indeterminate and impenetrable as hoplos being, right? The bare, or pure being, excuse me. And one should say that reason cannot think bare life except as it thinks pure being in stupor and in astonishment. Yet precisely these two empty and indeterminate concepts seems to safeguard the keys to the historical, political destiny of the West. And it may be that only if we are able to decipher the political meaning of pure being, we will be able to master the bare life that expresses our subjection to political power, just as it may be inversely that if we only if we understand the theoretical implications of bare life, will we be able to solve the riddle or the enigma of ontology. Brought to the limit of pure being, metaphysics, thought, passes over into politics, into reality. Just on the threshold, on the threshold of bare life, politics steps beyond itself into theory. So I think it's very important. He goes on and he goes into somebody, the great work of Dumézil, who Foucault learned a lot from, a great anthropologist, and Carali Caregni, the anthropologist, the Flamandial, the priests of classical Rome. And he goes into this kind of dualism, that the life that becomes the bios, the zoe, and the life of the Homo Sacer. Anyway, I find this very, very important here. Again, to look at it this way, and I want to just go to one other section here because this is very crucial for today. On page 184, now imagine the most extreme figure of the camp inhabitant, right? Primo Levi, and most of you probably know the periodic table, has described a person who in camp jargon was called the Muslim, der Musulman, right? A being from whom humiliation, horror, and fear had taken away all consciousness and all personality so as to make him absolutely apathetic, hence the ironical name given to him. He was not only, like his companions, excluded from the political and the social context to which he once belonged. He was not only, as Jewish life that does not deserve to live, destined to a future more or less close to death. He no longer belongs to the world of men in any way. He does not even belong to the threatened and precarious world of the camp inhabitants who have forgotten him from the very beginning. Mute and absolutely alone, he has passed into another world, without memory and without grief. For him, Holderl's statement that at the extreme limit of pain, nothing remains but the conditions of time and space holds to the level. What is the life, to the letter, what is the life of the Mussulman? Can one say it is pure Zoe, nothing natural or common? However, is left in him, nothing animal or instinctual remains in his life. All his instincts are canceled alone with his reason. Anselm tells us that the camp inhabitant was no longer capable of distinguishing between pangs of cold and the ferocity of the SS. If we apply this statement to the Muslim quite literally, the cold, SS, then we can say that he moves in an absolute indistinction of fact and law, of life and juridical rule, and of nature and politics. Because of this, the guard suddenly seems powerless before him, as if struck by the thought that the Mussulman's behavior, which does not register any difference between an order and the cold, might perhaps be a silent form of resistance. Hence, a law that seeks to transform itself entirely into life itself, confronted with a life that is absolutely indistinguishable from law, and it's precisely this indiscernibly that threatens the lex animata of the camp. So I'll stop there for a second. I think this is very relevant for today, what's going on, because we've called this, an open camp, what's going on in Gaza, etc. Of course, this notion of why the Mussulman became this bare life, the notion of silent resistance in many ways. So anyway, I mean, any thoughts about this? Is very, very interesting. This the last thing of us being, and I really find us to be on the threshold, right? In many ways. I mean, maybe not with the three thesis of Agamben, but certainly the sense of, the distinction between outside, inside, exclusion, and inclusion is collapsing very much. Production of life as a originary political element, and this kind of articulation between nature and culture, and bios and zoe, and the city no longer is the paradigm to be studied, but the camp is the fundamental paradigm of the West. So I don't know, any thoughts? I
Yeah,
mean,
it's interesting.
yeah.
And I agree. Yeah, this is very striking passage, and very striking, and especially where you stop reading, Michael, in that paragraph when he says, then we can say that the Mussulman moves in an absolute indistinction of fact and law, of life and juridical rule, and of nature and politics. This is literally, I think, a description of what happens when the political is completely collapsed, or it's been forced to be absent.
Right.
This is that condition where a human being is so disoriented because a human, to go back to Aristotle, we are obviously social, a vibrant social and fully developed social life is the precondition for us being human. That once we strip the political in the Aristotelian sense, we live life in this exact bare form. Literally, it's not bare simply because we are subject to the sovereign power in this case that is already declared as superfluous to the living, but while we're still alive, biologically speaking, we exist in this condition where we are, we're just the absolute indistinction of fact and law, of life and juridical rule, and of nature and politics. And maybe this is the starting point also of a digital social object of the human form, where the disorientation is so profound, if that's the right word, where we just are. We just are in the sense of a life of indistinction of the most fundamental categories, and of course that could be very disconcerting, to those who are in a position of control, of course, but maybe not if they recognize that, So I thought this was very interesting, like this description of what happens when the political has been shredded or purged completely, or as completely as possible. This is the bare life, right? I mean, this is the condition of bare life, the absoluteness, the indistinction of fact and law,
Yeah, I mean, I think this is a very powerful section also in a way that it does speak to the symptomatics of apathy, human apathy in the face of this, right? The inability to really act because of the apathia, right? That you're away from the suffering. You can no longer really even suffer, in a sense. The apathia, because for the Stoic logic, the apathia is a withdrawal, if you will, so that you don't go to taste the same doctrine again. It's very much like Freudian repetition compulsion. The Stoic learns from the doctrine so that we will not, undergo it again, right? In a sense. And this is the strategy of apathia. I don't want to suffer this twice. Or as Bob Dylan used to say, I want to know what price I have to pay to stop from going through the same thing twice, or eternal recurrence of the same, or even repetition compulsion in Freud. So I think that this is very important to look at too in contemporary apathy, right? That we're getting on so many fronts. I mean, we can laugh. I don't know if any of you saw the Saturday Night Live. I mean, I have crazy friends out there. They send me all this stuff. Saturday Night Live on the college presidents being interrogated here in the United States, the MIT, I don't know if you saw that, Beryl, the MIT president, Harvard, near Patrick, MIT or near Patrick, and then University of Penn, closer to Arto, right? Well, the three presidents went before the House of Representatives and basically were lambasted, and they were really completely, I don't know how many people saw this or have heard of this, but anyway, Saturday Night spoofed it, right? In a sense. So they had the three presidents, they're all totally lawyered up, acting like typical academics. Well, it's context dependent. If you talk about genocide, this is their favorite word that they're getting. It's a context decision. With all due respect, Congresswoman, and they had the Trump pit bull going after them. Anyway, so Saturday Night Live plays out these three in a kind of simulacra in a very funny way. And then finally, they add another character. So it's I forgot his name. He's a really funny black comic, right? He comes on. Well, I'm from the University of Phoenix. We're an online university. Anti-Semitism is our most popular course. He starts telling the congressman. So it's really funny, but in a sense, it speaks to where people actually get their politics, right? Instead of the historical, the apatheia leads to this kind of, it's fun, it's good comedy, it's a release, but at the same time, nothing is really learned except the release, right? Or, the online, we'll teach anything online, it's this guy's message, right? So anyway, I think this is a very beautiful thing also about that he's very good at not just saying a symptomatic moment of our time is apatheia or apathy, right? But we don't really speak to this at all, right? How much this has taken place. And to me, this is, I think, interesting with the Muslim, what he talks about, those that, are without memory, right? Those reduced, to not having memory, right? Etc. Yeah, very, very interesting. Yeah, very, very interesting how this is done, right? Mute, absolutely alone, passed to another world without memory and without grief, without the ability to suffer, without the ability to experience pathos or pathia, right? In many ways. So I think this is also important too, in many ways, this avoidance of the working through, this avoidance of the encounter.
And is it even possible to cancel somebody's instincts and reason? Because if you do that, what is left? I mean, you have you cancel the id. I mean, to use the kind of the Freudian and the ego and the superego. I mean, what is there left?
Right.
Other than the biomechanical beating of the heart and sort of going through the motions. That's the machinic. Maybe if we're reading like Deleuze and Guattari, they would probably say that's the machinic subconsciousness or the subjectivity or structure. The machinic, sort of like this nominally human, but stripped of all else, the void, that exists now in space of instinct and reason that have been somehow forced to disappear from the equation. What do you have? You have a machinic kind of being, machinic, simple repetition within this particular kind of sandbox way of living or way of being, automated existence. I mean, all these words and adjectives, right? We can go on and on and on. None of which are a great place to be because of the absence of those things which make being meaningful, right? So it's I agree. This is probably kind of the most profound part of the reading, right? Like these are really interesting, great sections about forcing us to think about what happens when you strip the political. Yeah.
Okay,
Yeah.
I can go back to page 184. Consider the person of the Führer in the Third Reich. He represents the unity and equality of stock of the German people. He's quoting Schmidt. He is not a despot or a dictator's authority. His is not a despot or a dictator's authority, which is imposed on the will and the persons of that subjects from outside, right? His power is rather all the more unlimited insofar as he is identified with the very biological life of the German people. This becomes very interesting. Yeah. I mean, this is right in some ways, maybe in a little more sophisticated term, the mass psychology of fascism. Why was the workers attracted to, National Socialism in the beginning, etc. By virtue of this identity, his every word is immediately law. Interesting. As Eichmann did not tire of repeating at his trial in Jerusalem, the book and reporters that got Arendt in a hell of a fix, she was ostracized for that book. People don't realize how vicious that community was in New York. I told you the story when she saw Irving Howe 2 years later. He went over to apologize, and she smoked Pall Mall cigarettes, and she took the long Pall Mall cigarette and dropped the ashes on his very nice coat and walked away when he came to apologize her for the way his people acted, during this period of Eichmann in Jerusalem, her reportage, right? Especially the concept of the banality of evil, right? Yeah, that was the concept that really got people, right? Etc. So by virtue of his identity, his every word is law, right? And he recognizes himself immediately in his own command. This is interesting too, how this mirror and this stage is really going on, how this completely unified narcissism works, right? If you want to look at it that way, right? In a sense, right? And he can certainly have a private life, but what defines him as a Führer is that his existence as such has an immediately political character. Yeah. Right? Interesting. Thus, while the office of the Chancellor of the Reich is a public dignitatis received on the basis of procedures foreseen in the Weimar Constitution, the office of the Führer is no longer an office in the sense of traditional public law, but rather something that originates or springs forth without mediation from his person insofar as it coincides with the life of the German people. Now, you don't think Trump does this with the right-wing populism? Very much a similar kind of technique that's working in Trump. I mean, not as refined, not as, etc. Maybe, hopefully, maybe even more dangerous, who knows? But anyway, the Führer is the political form of this life. That is why his word is law, right? And why he demands nothing to the German people except what in truth already is. Very interesting, right? Yeah. There are no interpretations. They're just facts. And I am the law of the facts. Right? In a sense, right? Yeah.
The indistinction between law and fact. Yeah.
Exactly. Yeah, exactly. And here's the traditional distinction, the distinction here between the sovereign's political body and its physical body, the Kantakeritz. And if you haven't read it, it's a wonderful book, The King's Two Bodies, Ernst Kantakeritz, etc. And the two bodies are drastically contracted into one. The Führer has, so to speak, a whole body that is neither private nor public. Interesting, huh? Maybe it's the body without organ that the Deleuze and Guattari were talking about, the BWOs, right? Yeah. In other words, right, his body is situated at the point of coincidence between Zoe and Bios, biological body, and political body. This is very interesting, right? In his person, Zoe and Bios incessantly pass over to one another. And then he juxtaposes this in the next paragraph. I think this is remarkable, between the extreme the Levy's description that I read earlier, right? He'll juxtapose this to the inhabitant of the camp and the Muslim, right? In a sense. So you can read here in some ways what is going on. Listen, again, I don't want to make this into just a session on Gaza, but think about what's going on there. If you what you would use of Agamben to understand, what's on these people's minds right now. This right-wing Likud party that is becoming more and more extreme every minute, right, etc., versus that of the contrast of the open city camp now where they're being displaced from the camp, hoarded into other places where they're still being attacked. Try to think about this paradigm, that plays out inversely, right? Not this time with the Führer, the one body, right? but a prime minister and his cast of characters that are playing this out, as a new kind of domination, a new kind of supreme domination, and done so with the backing completely of the liberal state. Completely with the liberal state. I mean, I don't know if you want to go there, or if you tell me I'm going too far with this, but yeah, I mean, this is very interesting to me. How this Agamben paradigm, right, the biopolitical paradigm, plays out before our eyes right now. I
Oh
mean,
yeah, the Israeli population completely supports it.
okay,
They completely support it. They're like, okay, yeah, you're killing, good. I mean, it's a bloodlust for revenge.
right. I mean, I don't know if anybody else, I mean, in some ways, yeah. I mean, do we want, should we substitute the Palestinian here instead of the Muslim, or what's going on? I don't know. I'm just saying, as a possibility for discussion.
Yeah, a Muslim with a gun.
Yes, indeed.
As far as the word Musulman, I'm thinking of Remarque and the novel on resistance, and the term Musulman in the concentration camps.
Right, exactly.
Okay, I'll shut up.
The camp jargon. No, you're right. I mean, he says this, the camp jargon. I'm not talking about, quote, the Muslim Brotherhood here, or, it's, this is not what I mean here. Yeah. But it translates into a kind of vernacular, right? The Muslim.
Yeah. I mean, he was writing this after 9/11, right?
Yes.
It's a disconcerting passage. It's very, very, I don't know, it rings true, you know what I mean? In 1995, okay.
No, I'm thinking of Remarque's novel of resistance, the term Mussulman after World War I, or during Nazi occupation in World War
And
II.
then was used, yes, in the camp to identify those who resisted.
Yeah.
Right. Yeah. No.
Yeah. Yeah.
Anyway, I mean, I can leave it. I mean, we can always come back. I mean, but I thought this notion of the threshold where Agamben is in a certain way at the end of this first book of his long project, this is before State of Exception, right? This is the opening book, right, in the series about Homo Sacer. So this is laying the groundwork, this work to be fair to him, and again. I also found that they're very interesting sections here, of course, in the beginning, when he goes back to the, again, the corpus, right, the body. This is something that, Marx and Marxism had a very hard time of engaging up until Reich. The body was never part of the discourse, right? And in fact, maybe Marx's great discovery was the laborer's body, how it's destroyed in some way. So the politicization of life, the first section of the book, in a sense, this is a very interesting, again, another comment here. And he takes this from Arendt. Obviously he's looking at her very carefully. The concentration camps, and this is page 120, are the laboratories in the experiment of total domination. And this is a notion we should really use, Arto, I think in all of us, is the laboratory, as Marx said, the putrefaction of life is our laboratory, right? Marx said that, the putrefaction of life. The concentration of laboratories is an experiment of total domination. For human nature being what it is, the goal can be achieved only under the extreme circumstances of human-made hell. This is Arendt. But what escapes Arendt, and this is page 120, middle of the first paragraph, right? Escapes her the inverse of what she takes it to be, and that precisely the radical transformation, again, of politics into the realm of bare life. That is, into a camp, legitimated and necessitated total domination. Only because politics in our age has been entirely transformed into biopolitics was it possible for politics to be constituted as totalitarian politics to a degree hitherto unknown, unless we looked at this through the lens of biopolitics. And again, part of the argument here is not, the Nazism itself was not just the result of capitalism and, struggles between inter-imperialist powers anymore. And I think we've been through that in, the Chapoutot book, as well as in some of the other things we've read, including Stiegler. But it was something very radically different, as we said, earlier, about, against the state in some ways, right? And kind of interesting how he's positioning this, part of what, was said, by, Chapoutot and others, against this liberal notion of the state and read it as a state just of total domination, right? So I think he's also going there. And I mean, this
In
is
fact, the state, I mean, if I understood it correctly, I was getting from the Chapoutot reading that, in fact, reliance on a powerful state,
right,
especially if it had some kind of Republican rights or political rights, would make it more difficult to have a politics of bare life.
yes,
Because the possibility that the majority, which is clearly the target for exploitation, etc., would have at least an institutional structure that it could possibly influence. Whereas in the Nazi case, they didn't like the state because the state left open the possibility for class struggle and for other related political forms, that would allow the non-master races to wield effective political power. So in fact, the presence of a state actually might be, but is a barrier to Nazi-style politics, or through South African-style politics, or through, U.S. government politics against Native American, reservation-style, the imposition of reservations, because, weren't the Nazis very much inspired by the reservations that Native Americans were forced into, right? This was sort of like the final solution that appealed to them as a model when they were starting to think about, replacing class struggle with race war, because the early Nazis did practice class struggle, right? When they had a so-called left wing, with Strasser and, the national Bolsheviks, so to speak.
Junger was a national Bolshevik.
Right.
Ernst Junger was
But the Night of the Long Knives, got rid of the class conflict section of the Nazi party and streamlined things towards, the project of race-based politics. So in that sense, the state is, this was maybe, I wasn't understanding Agamben, but I think he sees this happening through the state, and Chapoutot saying, no, this is happening over the state, in the Nazi practical approach to this, right? So the Nazi reduction of the political into the camp happened through the instrumental use of a state, while its constant subversion was also taking place by the Nazis, because they saw the state as the, as the remnant of a previous and thus kind of inferior, wrong-headed form of politics, inherited from the old absolute period of absolute rulers, infused with the poisonous ideas of the French Revolution and kind of Jewish politics, quote unquote, right? I mean, this was literally the quotes that Chapoutot was citing of the Nazi theorists.
Right. Yeah. I just wanted to read, I mean, yeah, I see where you're going. I think this is important too, this notion, and maybe we can add this to Homo datum, Homo corpus, right? This is on page 123. Consider instead of the formula of the writ, this is the writ of habeas corpus. He's reviewing a very good history here. That the Act of 1679 generalized and makes into the law, and he quotes the Latin here, which is then translated. We command that you have before us to show at Westminster that body X, by whatever name he may be called therein, which is held in your custody, as it is said, as well as the cause of the arrest and the detention. And then Agamben, nothing allows one to measure the difference between ancient and medieval freedom and the freedom at the basis of modern democracy better than this formula. Right? It is not the free man and his statutes and his prerogatives, not even simply homo, but rather corpus, that is the new subject of politics. And this represents a turn that's really a Foucaultian turn, in political thinking. And democracy is born precisely as the assertion and the presentation of this body, quote unquote, habeas corpus ad subjectiscendum. You will have a body. We will have to have a body to show, right? Habeas corpus, right? You must be in possession. The fact then of all the various jurisdictional regulations concerned with the protection of individual freedom, this is very interesting. It was habeas corpus that assumed the form of the law and thus became inseparable from the history of Western democracy, is surely due to mere circumstance. It is just as certain, however, that nascent European democracy thereby placed at the center of its battle against absolutism, not bios, the qualified life of the citizen, but zoe, the bare, anonymous life, is as such taken into the sovereign band, the body of being taken, as one still reads in one modern formulation of the writ, by whatsoever name he may be called therein. Very interesting here, to be taken, that really, in a sense, it's kind of like the Parmenidean poem. It's the story of a kidnapping, in which, in the beginning, the mares that drive me away. And here, being taken away, the body being taken away, the zoe, anonymous life that is taken into the sovereign band, the body of being taken, right? What comes to light in order to the exposed apud Westminster is once again the body of Homo Sacer, which is to say, bare life, once again, right? Just bare life, yeah. So again, I think we have to think about too, Arto, this Homo datum in the context of the corpus too, right?
Yeah.
Constantly, that this is something that comes up, and he is really trying to look. I mean, in my sense, the argument is really with Hobbes and social contract theory, from Hobbes to Rousseau. He's really trying to say that it's not the social contract that builds this. Let's go back to the Magna Carta. Let's go to habeas corpus and see where we are. So this is very interesting. Yeah. And yeah, I mean, there's so much here. I don't know. I mean, maybe some other people have some things to say. I mean, one other thing that I have is the sense of euthanasia, which is on page 142, life unworthy of being lived, and that biopolitics, where biopolitics turns into thanatopolis, right? Politics, which is death politics, in many ways. And then he goes into National Socialist Right, marks the point where the integration end of the section life that does not deserve to live, which is again something interesting, a slogan that could be used in terms of this complete assault on the Palestinian people. The point of where the integration of medicine and politics, which is one of the essential characteristics of modern biopolitics, began to assume its final form. This implies that the sovereign decision on bare life comes to be displaced from strictly political motivations and areas to a more ambiguous terrain in which the physician and the sovereign seem to exchange roles. Kind of interesting there, how the medical, right, takes over in the political, right? And then he begins with this new institute, German Institute in Paris, in the next section, publication to talk about the merits of National Socialist politics and the health that it brings, right? So he's reading documents very well. To me, the most impressive thing about Agamben is how closely he follows Foucault in reading the archive and how good he is at it, right? Whether or not you agree with the interpretations of that, of course, to disprove him would really go over those archives and see what he's synthesizing and, bringing together here in some ways, right? Yeah. So, and then of course, there's a passage on eugenics on page 148 too, we all know. And this is interesting too, Arendt and origins of, and this is on Heidegger, by the way. This is Arendt and origins of totalitarianism at the end of the book. And remember, as Patrick points out, this is, Agamben's 1995, Arendt's book, I think, is 55, if I'm not mistaken, the origins of totalitarianism. Precisely this immediate unity of politics and life makes it possible to shed light on the scandal of modern 20th century philosophy, the relationship, this is page 150, between Martin Heidegger and Nazism. Only when situated in the perspective of modern biopolitics does this relation acquire its proper significance. And this is the very thing that both Heidegger's accusers and his defenders both failed to do. The great novelty of Heidegger's thought, which did not elude the most attentive observers at Davos, such as Franz Rosenzweig and Emmanuel Levinas, there was that it resolutely took root in facticity. Right? Facticity is crucial to being in time, to design and design analysis. As the publication of the lecture courses from the early 20s has by now shown, ontology appears in Heidegger from the very beginning as a hermeneutics of facticity or of a factical life. The circular structure by which design is an issue for itself in its ways of being is nothing but a formalization of the essential experience of factical life in which it is impossible to distinguish between life and its actual situation, being and its ways of being, for which all the distinctions of traditional anthropology, such as that of distinctions between spirit and body, sensation and consciousness, I and world, subject and properties, are abolished. For Heidegger, the central category of facticity is not, as it was for Husserl, Zufälligkeit, contingency. This is very interesting, by which one thing is in a certain way and in a certain place, yet could be elsewhere and otherwise, but rather Verfallenheit, fallenness, right? Not contingency, but our fallenness, which characterizes a being that is and has to be its own ways of being. Facticity does not simply mean being contingently in a certain way and in a certain situation, but rather means decisively assuming this way and this situation by which what was given must be transformed into a task, right? Dasein, the being there, who is its I there, thus comes to be placed in a zone of indiscernibility with respect to and to mark the definite collapse of all traditional determinations of man.
So we're back again with the Musulman.
Yes.
So Heidegger anticipated the
Yes.
concentration camp as the generalized condition of life under modern society,
Yes,
capitalist
what
society.
the Western metaphysical
With a Western
would bring us. Yes.
would bring us
Yes.
20 years before the
70,
camps.
20 years before the camps, or 15,
15 years. Yeah.
15 years before.
Again, the crucial moment is that indiscernibility,
Right.
the collapse of all traditional determinations of man.
Right. Yeah. And if I can go on, this is Arendt, and you're not going to be happy with this so much, Arto, but it's kind of interesting
It's all right.
the way she does it. In a text of 1934 that may be, well, even today still constitute the most valuable contribution to an understanding of National Socialism, Levinas proves himself the first, Emmanuel Levinas, to underline the analogies between this new ontological determination of man and certain traits of the philosophy implicit in Hitlerism, right? Judeo-Christian and liberal thought, according to Levinas, arrive for the spirit's aesthetic liberation from the bounds of the sensuous and the historical social situation into which it finds itself thrown, right? Thus ultimately differentiating in man and his world between a realm of reason and a realm of the body, to which the realm of reason is irreducibly opposed. Hitler's philosophy in this respect, similar to Marxism, is instead, Levinas argues, founded on an absolutely unconditional assumption of the historical, physical, and material situation, which is considered an indissoluble cohesion of spirit and body, nature and culture. Right? Interesting, right? How this plays out, how this becomes unified again in this figure of the Führer, etc. So, I mean, you certainly can comment, but I think what he's really talking about, this realm of reason, because, of course, Marx is going to claim a new kind of reason, right? I mean, we think of reason very differently after we read Marx, the inversion of Hegelian reason, etc. But Levinas is setting up an opposition. She's actually summarizing Levinas here, right? Yeah. So I think this is, again, something to look at. In Heidegger, there is really no category of reason, ultimately, of his own. He goes through, as you pointed out, minimal reason in education, which I thought was, a brilliant stroke on your part to talk about kids today are given minimal reason, maybe less than minimal, or maybe a modicum of reason in the schools. But for Heidegger, reason is part of, again, the Western metaphysical destiny. He is not Kantian reason, Hegelian reason, or for that matter, Marxian reason. So we have to think about that too, the Vernunften, the raison, how it's reasoned, etc. And I think in a way he's really looking, again, trying to look at this again, giving the form to life again through this corpus, right, through the body, this notion of habeas corpus, having a body, right? And so anyway, he goes on, with the whole, I won't read the whole thing, but this is very interesting here, this whole section of Levinas, several reflections on the elections, I like Levinas in the beginning. I don't like his later work personally, but I like his book on the critique of the intuition of essences, a critique of Wesenschauen in Husserl. It's a very solid book on the problem of intuiting essences in Husserl. Major contribution to the phenomenological tradition. So anyway, I mean, this is the whole section, again, politics or giving life, is about the relationship. If you're in, I mean, of course, I'm totally interested, this notion of Heidegger and the Nazi project and, what's coming out more and more today, etc. I think it really takes away from the value of reading Heidegger and how much we can still learn. But anyway, this is interesting the way he goes about it. I think it's a very thing, in a sense. It is precisely what characterizes the biological, this is the end point. I mean, I won't read again, it's multiple pages, page 153, yet it is precisely what characterizes the biopolitical turn of modernity, the condition in which we find ourselves. So our human condition, if you will, or our homo datum, if you will, situation, if we want to situate ourselves, is the biopolitical turn of modernity. And this is the point at which Nazism and Heidegger's thought radically diverge. Nazism determines the bare life of Homo Sacer in a biological and a eugenic key. Very important, yep. Making it into the site of an incessant decision on value and non-value in which biopolitics continually turns into thanatopolitics, in which the camp consequently becomes the absolute political space. In Heidegger, on the other hand, Homo Sacer, whose very own life is always at issue in its every act, instead becomes Dasein, right? The inseparable unity of being and ways of being, of subjects and qualities, life and world, whose own being is at issue in its very being. If life in modern politics is immediately politics, Hence, this unity, which itself has the form of an irrevocable decision, withdraws from every external decision and appears as an indissoluble cohesion in which it is impossible to isolate something like a bare life. In the state of exception, become the rule, the life of Homo Sacer, which was the correlate of sovereign power, turns into existence over which power no longer seems to have any hold. So in some ways, he's taking up, Heidegger as a thinker of anarchy, a thinker of the anarchy, that without principle, moving away from the Greek arche, which literally means obedience, commandment, and beginning in one, right? The arche, from which, some people think anarchy is, anarchia, if you, the alpha privative, means you're moving away from the principles in many ways. Yeah. So very interesting here, what he's doing. I think this chapter is worth, studying more, in a sense, not only for the sake of reading Heidegger, but to trying to understand the difference between, where the Western metaphysical tradition may lead us and that of what the Nazis were really doing, what this moment was, this state. Yeah. For Heidegger, by the way, the politics, the polos, is preceded by the poetics. You poetically dwell before the political is formed, before the community. This is always very important to keep in mind, that the a priori is always poetics. The poetic is always there. For Badiou, on the other hand, it's the mathematic, the mathematical ontology, the being of the, the number, right, if you will, right? Yeah. So Badiou is closer to Homo datum, whereas Heidegger would be very, crucial. I mean, Badiou would not have a kind of ethical quandary with cybernetics like Heidegger would, in my estimation at this point. Yeah.
Yeah. It's just interesting how when in the vernacular we use words like, not we, but like the media says, oh, Trump is a fascist, or, et cetera, et
I have
cetera.
no idea what they're saying.
I have no idea what they're talking about and how different the Nazis were, and it doesn't mean that it's what we're going through is less terrifying, but maybe these
Nazis
people
would never spend $1 million on a lawyer who put together citations at random that had no basis in the law. The Nazis were not stupid that way. I'm sorry to say, but anyway, the latest Trump blunder, right? He's got lawyers putting together citations from all over the place that have no grounding in facticity. They made up half of the citations. $1 million bill. Nice work if you can get it, I guess. I don't know. Right? Yeah. So very interesting. Yeah. Yeah. So any thoughts, Arto, or anybody else? I mean, this is a very dense work. I mean, again, I'm not saying please become an Agambenite, but yeah. See the reference to Erica Remarquez. Which book is that, George?
Spark of Life.
The Spark of Life. Yeah. Okay. Yeah.
The term Musselman was in there, and I as a prisoner, and
Right.
I knew that before. So that was that, and it was Madame Chachat.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you.
And you.
Yeah. Good. Yeah.
Yeah, I think this idea of the camp and the bare, the bare life and the corpus, I think that's probably that's something that we need to think about to evaluate whether we are living through a transition from Homo Sacer to Homo datum, or whether Homo datum is just within the same orbit of Homo Sacer, but in a different way now. So that's.
Well, how do we integrate again the corpus into Homo datum? What is it doing to the body, in a sense? Yeah.
I think if we follow your teacher Schurman, I think maybe one way we can talk about it is the externalization of the body from the body itself. It's reestablishment in the datum, into the data, into the emerging infrastructure sense making, which are these artificial intelligence, simulated human intelligence, sufficiently minimally sufficient simulations of human reasoning, which are existing outside of us, outside of the bodies, literally. They exist in the form of ethereal, metaphysical objects which have social functioning as a corpus. The corpus is digitized, literally. It's externalized. Which I guess is part of the continuation of the proletarianization project. It's a loss of how to do and how to think, but it's also now a loss of the body too. Like you can play music without playing a musical instrument.
Right.
You can just type, generate some music that sounds like this because my creativity wants to hear that, and you can be the author of it, and you can even get you can make money from it. You know, there's artificial intelligence services. You can pay $10 a month to generate music that you upload to YouTube as playlists. And if they get 100,000 listeners, you make money out of it. But your corpus was literally not part of it.
Right.
You know,
right. No, it's interesting. I had an interesting conversation this morning with the editor of a New York City Jazz Record, which is a trade paper, very good trade paper. And we talked about our various backgrounds, and and he told me, I asked him, were you ever a musician? He says he was, but he discovered that he'd rather listen to music, that he was never going to be Coltrane. He was a sax player. So he became a listener, and there was so much music to listen to, he no longer, really played, right? So he became what he thought of himself as a creative listener, kind of what you're saying here in some ways, and he has this, he reviews and has obviously a very well-trained ear, but he will not make music, right? But he thinks he's making something by listening, so you could kind of invert that, the active listener or the active ear or whatever, we want to, call it. But you're absolutely right. Yeah.
So I wonder if an interesting reading, either for this seminar or for follow-on seminars, would be some of those sections from Sherman's book where he talks about externalization and the ground.
Which one, from Being and Acting or Broken Hegemonies?
Right. He doesn't talk about the externalization of the ground, but he talks about the ground as the recursive logic to the self. And
Right.
I think it's from the first book. It's not the hegemony. It's not the broken. Yeah.
One of the translators of that book, I'll tell you a little story, inside story. Christine Gross, a wonderful person, very lovely, but she hated to be in social spaces, right? So she worked on Wall Street, and she worked, I think, for Morgan Stanley. So they gave her a cubicle way away from everybody. She was so valuable to the firm, so she didn't have to meet with anybody during the day, etc. But when it came to philosophy, great. I mean, and she was one of the major translators of that book, because that book was written in French first, as a translated version from the French by about 3 different translators. Yeah. It's very interesting. Christine had her own little private cubicle on Wall Street because she couldn't stand being with people. Being she liked, being in the world, but not being with others.
Yeah.
Right, etc. So anyway, yeah.
So I think this externalization, from the corpus.
Externalization, is in Lukács too, in the chapter on reification, externalization and objectification, in the reification chapter. It's very interesting that the worker externalizes, in terms of the production of the commodity. Not only is it the work of alienation, it's also the work of externalization and objectification that is taking place. And, in German, there's a distinction between the Gegenstand as an object that stands opposite to you versus the object, in which you're a subject-object relation. So the Gegenstand is very powerful in Heidegger, in German philosophy, and leads much more to a stronger sense of, if you will, objectivity, for whatever, we use of that term anymore. But yeah.
Yeah, in the Russian too, the notion of objectification is more like literally condition of profound loss of that which makes you human. You
Right.
become that which is the object now, and it's not an alienation. It's more than that.
Right.
So yeah, I think the what happens to the corpus, the body is being externalized.
Yeah.
But progressively,
These
progressively.
sentences, I'll read you something apropos of what you're talking about, and this is your influence in some ways. Agamben argues that the contemplative ability, he makes this Aristotelian distinction between the active life and the contemplative life, not to perform a creative act or not to do creative act, actually is higher standing than the actual artistic performance, right? Of the creative work. So what you're talking about in some ways, so it's like Gould with the Goldberg variations, it stems from his ability not to play the piano, or really not play the piano, the double, movement of the negation, what he's going through, ignoring the praxis that supports the underlying thing of a virtuoso pianist, in some ways. So I think that you're on to something here in terms of, where Agamben's trying to go with possibility as higher than actuality. That are the things. Yeah. And yes, and Patrick has a good comment in the chat. Yeah. The notion of, of prothesis. Right. Absolutely. Yeah. Very, very important. Yeah. I mean, they begin to be nice, connections here, nice mosaics that we're building, if you will. Yeah, putting some of these together. Yeah. But yeah, no, I mean, I hear you. Yeah, in a lot of ways. So potential energy for again, going back to Aristotle and the physics, where energia, and the ergon, are played out, where one sees this relationship between dynamis and actuality, right? The potential energy. He's more, Agamben seems to be always interested in potentiality. In the beginning was potentiality, and that's higher, as Heidegger says vis-a-vis Kant, the thesis on being, that possibility is higher than actuality. So he's not really interested only in praxis, right? Somehow, in an interesting way, he's he's kind of getting away what Agamben ultimately calls, because I've read The Coming Community, he calls the fetishization of work in the Marxist tradition, alienated work, et cetera, and that this leads to ultimately a kind of, this was a criticism of Marx or Marxism, if you will, maybe not of Marx himself, but of Marxism, that had led to a labor metaphysics, right? In some senses, yeah.
Fetishization of labor as the home of being, right?
Yes,
to use like
exactly.
pseudo.
Very good point. Yeah.
But I think that Kant's phrase, potentiality is
Possibility.
the possible.
In Aristotle, it's potentiality,
right,
is higher than actuality,
and then the
possibility
is higher
than actuality. Yes, in the German. I'm just trying to be true, because yeah.
And that's really the fundamental idea.
Yes,
if one believes this, I mean, it exposes a train of thought that exposes the situation that we're in.
Well, it's a revolutionary idea, right? I mean, really, ultimately, yeah, is that we're just
if we defer
yes
to the socialized cybernetic platforms,
right,
for things that are related to the possibilities that make our life livable, that's a profound regression.
Yes.
When compared to using socialized cybernetic platform to imagine things that wouldn't be imaginable without the social cybernetics. That's the difference in the application, but that difference is political, because under capitalism, for the vast majority of the population, we're being sold that which already exists is higher than the potentiality or the possibility. Right. In other words, when you use a social network, or when you use these technologies, you're encouraged to use them according to that which already exists. You use the system, you use something that is already present, right? It's presented to you as like an already become data. Data is something that's already been formed.
Yeah.
And it's not liable nor conducible for change, right? Because it's a condition of error. to go outside of the code that's already been pre-written.
Right.
That's just the nature of the computer, right? Of
Right.
the social, of the electrical computer. But what Kant is saying, and what Heidegger and what Agamben, that the possibility or the potential, the imaginary, right,
Yes.
is more important than that which already exists, which already has been imagined, right? Which in the Marxist kind of dogmatic fetishization of labor would be the notion of that what is a cup of coffee that you're drinking? That's just congealed labor. That's labor that's already something that human labor that's already been expelled, right? And thus you should respect labor as the most important thing that humans do, because it gives you the things. It's the condition of possibility for you drinking coffee and for everything else that you do, which is true. But even more important than that is what leads to labor, or creative labor, not work,
Very
which
good.
is the imaginary. So this is why I think the great Soviet thinkers like Ilenkov and stuff, because they already were trying to, what is the next stage beyond capitalism? Well, you got to overcome alienated labor. How are you going to overcome alienated labor? You can't just do it by liberating the worker from the capitalist manager. It's not enough, because a new manager will just emerge and fulfill the role of the capitalist manager. You got to focus all of your attention to thinking, to creativity, to fomenting creativity, to developing creativity in every person in society, starting with the next generation and etc. Because then you go back to what Aristotle and Kant were saying, right? And that's the condition for a life other than the bourgeois life that is in store for us, which is the life of that which already exists. I think the capitalists today, in the most dynamic sectors of capitalism, like the startup culture or like the .com, the whole notion of innovation, they're trying to capture that. They're trying to identify and exploit, you know.
Well, that was $100 million that was targeted to the University of Pennsylvania that was withdrawn because of the president's inability to call out the anti-Semitic remarks, right, et cetera, on campus. He is about doing a school of capitalist innovation at Wharton in Pennsylvania,
which tries to capture the
which
tries to identify and capture the potential or potentiality and convert it into capital or whatever, understanding that they live in a society which is capitalist society, which does not encourage such behavior, right? In fact, encourages the opposite. So, yeah.
I mean, what Agamben calls it, just since I've read probably a little more than the people here of Agamben, he uses the term, instead of constitutive power, he uses destituent power that deconstitutes all forms of power. So he uses destituent power, right? Right? Yeah. And you know, and that's basically, he wants to create a utopic, anarchic community in a sense, right? Right. So yeah, he uses this, that labor leads to not constitutive, activity ultimately, but destitution, if you will, in some ways. Yeah.
How does that compare to Arendt's notion of labor?
As twofold, you mean?
Yeah.
Distinguishes between labor and work, as you know, right? In the
Yeah.
human condition. Yeah. I mean, that's interesting, because for her, I think that labor is a modern concept, whereas work is something that was necessary, right? I mean, in her ergon, in the Aristotelian sense, is necessary, whereas the labor is something of modernity that is a degradation, if you will, of work, right? In some senses. So she makes that.
Which points to the point that Arturo's making about the way in which the imagination within the labor process itself.
Yes.
Where she says that other form is basically, it strips it out.
Yes.
It's really at the level of the logic of the generation of surplus value.
Yes.
And Marx talks about living labor, you know, in terms of which it goes beyond that. And that's, I think, what, so.
Right.
Yeah, no, Patrick, absolutely. And it's almost like the stripping of that is the condition of possibility for the extraction of capital, of surplus labor.
Yeah, and that's a problem with artificial intelligence. It essentially, it replicates what has been.
The dead labor.
It's
Yeah,
looking into the rearview mirror, as it were,
right.
and basically has eliminated the notion of imagination. So
Yeah. Yeah, it that's very interesting. Yeah, it eliminates it's almost like it digs deeper through the remnants of dead labor in order to cobble together some kind of an insight for the continuation of dead labor in the future. And in the meantime, we're actively discouraged from using our imagination even more so.
mhm.
Uh,
Yeah.
I did this experiment for myself. I was trying to write this paper, and it's not going well because I don't want to write it, and I want to do something else.
Familiar.
So I signed up for this artificial intelligence designed for, paper write, like academic researchers. It's called Sci something. It's a Sci Site. It's a British company, and it's. So what happens is, okay, they're like, so what do you want to research? So I typed, I don't know, what is data in contemporary cybernetic theory, for example. And it gave me millions of, it gave me like 190,000 relevant academic articles from across the world. And it translated, Chinese and English in real time and everything in 3 seconds. And then it said, these are some choices. And I said, okay, so I like this summary or this abstract. So I read this abstract, and then this little box, it says, ask me a question about this abstract. So then I said, give me a summary of this paper. So then it gave me the summary in 2 seconds. And then it said, you can ask follow-up questions. So I said, okay, in this summary, they're discussing the concept of, whatever. Tell me more about whatever. Give me some literature to read about whatever. And what I discovered was, at the end of the 45 minutes that I spent with this software, is I knew even less than when I started with, because it sends you in this like hole of already dead research, already done research. So you accumulate facticals, you accumulate dry, real facts, which is the result of other people's labor. But so what happens in the meantime, as you accumulate facts and you're following through this research, is that your creativity, your ability to imagine, like, what is data and what is based on what this person said, and the creative aspect is completely suckered out. And you're left with this kind of sensation that, or at least I was left with the sensation that I just lost 45 minutes of my life and I have no idea what happened. It's like basically I went to work in an office. It's like you know what I mean? Like I went to work in an office because I know what was happening. The algorithms were actually querying me and what I was interested in. So in other words, the capitalist structure that was offering itself as my research assistant was actually interested in what I was interested in as a way of making money off of my research question, So it's like, it's really a poor use of the technology, of course. It's just a mediocre, I mean, so far, who knows what's going to happen, but.
And you become part of the learning
Yes, of course.
that it's doing.
Yeah, you're right. And it changes the way I approach writing the paper, or I approach studying it according to its ways,
Yeah.
It's very destructive. I mean, if it's used like that, it's very, very destructive. Or like I tested this other thing too for this podcast. It says, okay, and upload your recorded file and then click on this button to improve it and make it ready, right? And it's going to select like 30 seconds of what the algorithm feels are the most interesting part for the audience, right? Based on 100 million analyzed YouTube videos that were liked a lot by people. So you click on the button and you're like, it's going to make my podcast better because I don't have to worry about like manually choosing the section of my podcast that's the most interesting part. And, so I clicked the button, and then 30 seconds later, I got the final version along with the short video. And it's like, I couldn't use it. It wasn't better. It didn't sound better. And it wasn't the 30 seconds that I found most interesting. And in fact, it was the 30 seconds that I found the worst. So it's like, what's going on here? There's a problem in the basic premise but I think Peter's right. I think we're being asked to use more dead objects that are the product of human labor as if there's something creative. It's a substitution problem. It substitutes that wonderful thing called, leaping into the unknown and our imaginary that all human beings have, and we've always do engage, we're actively asked not to use it, or to use it less and less and less in exchange for congealed kind of remnants of some other people's creativity, that,
it's the fear of pathos again, going back to this whole thing of where apathy comes from. Ultimately, it's so easy just to push the buttons, do simple deductive logic, right, etc. Then, as you say, take the plunge into the abyss, or dance in the abyss, see if you can still dance, or put a foot in and dance over it, or walk the tightrope, etc. Because it's too easy to do it the other way. And as we all know in academia, 95% of the paper that's turned out is coming from this kind of machinic logic that you just presented, right? This is the quality of the papers that are coming out. There's no original thinking. There's no real engagement. You don't feel the passion of the inquiry at all, etc. So yeah. So we end up in this, again, as you say, this kind of homo datum, and we become ourselves the digitalized object, as Patrick was saying. We become socialized this way. We're part of the learning process. It's learning us. We're not, and you say, Arto, I didn't learn a damn thing. So you've been had, right, in a sense, by the system. You're a targeted assassination of your mind.
Exactly. That's a good one. That's a good one.
Right.
The targeted assassination
Of the mind.
A little bit more upbeat though, Michael.
Okay, I'll be a little more upbeat next time.
No, I can. I'm forgetting.
I've been listening to too much Billie Holiday lately. Yeah.
No, there was something upbeat. I'm forgetting it now. So I'll go back to Arto.
Well, I mean, if we're going to use this idea of, and I think Patrick said it too, like if we're asked to take on a new crutch, if we're asked as human beings, as a society, to put on a new prosthetics, to make our life better or whatever, I mean, it's worth interrogating, because it's a new prosthetic device that which means we're gonna give something up.
Okay,
because
I'm sorry, I got it.
No,
I got it from last week on Upbeat. What shocked me last week was that the category, the person who was academic advisor at college, was no longer there. And I still remember mine from 50 years ago. And so the upbeat part is we just need to make sure we get people in positions of, such as academic advisor. What course should I take? Where should I go? So that's one. The elimination of that.
Part of the problem is the elimination of the courses they can take. This is another thing we're going through, not to be.
Well, that Rikers Island had over 40 licenses before. Now you've got 4. No, I
So George, I can give you a kind of it's not a downer, but maybe just like a contemporary version of what the college advisement has become, at least in a big public university. There's a socialized cybernetic system called, the software platform that keeps track of every student's degree progression, or they call it the career progression, because they didn't bother to change the word from the corporate package, which was designed for HR departments, to the college, college advisement. So there's a digital socialized cybernetic object, which is a computer system where every student's, progression is tracked, and you got a menu of choices to take, right? And a bunch of rules. So the student comes in, and this is like the typical college advisement experience now that I've had, and I'm sure many others who teach today too. And the question is basically, I'm here to be advised for next semester, which basically means tell me what classes I need to take so I can graduate as fast as possible. And the kids are taught that, right? That's the message that the university presses. So then you say, well, what do you want to study? I mean, what do you want to take? Biology? What do you want to be? And they're like, I don't know. I'm a political science major. Okay. So the system, the cybernetic brain, the externalized, the prosthetic brain says, you need to take these red boxes in order for them to become green, because green is good and red is bad. And if you have more green than red, then you're on your way to, if it's all green, you graduate. So then the student says, but I don't want to I'm not really interested in any of those 3 classes that are green for next semester. Like, I don't want to take any of them, but I guess I have to. So what do you want to take? And they're like, well, we want to take philosophy. So then I look at my computer system, and then it says under philosophy, those classes do not count towards the major, so the student should not be taking them.
Yes.
Why? Because they're wasting their time, because they're not progressing towards graduation. So you see the immediate contradiction. The class that you want to take, you should not take because it does not help your graduation, right? You can't count it towards graduation. But what if you do want to take that class because you're curious about it? You can, because we're liberals. We can't tell you can't,
Yeah.
but we're going to tell you that it's not going to count towards your credit. So most of the students are going to be like, well, then I'm not going to take it. It's a waste of my time. I'm going to take longer to graduate. So that's the foreclosure right there. And on a certain infinitesimally small but significant way, there's a foreclosure that happened there. The student did not take a class that they wanted to take, which violates the fundamental principle of higher education, which is, right, to encourage the development of the intellect, right?
Right.
So that's what college advisement is like. It's to follow a pre-existing structure that already exists as an unchangeable object because you cannot change it. It's a database. And that's what college advisement is, to follow the externalized logic of the digital object, which is called the advisement database or software or whatever. And you can't not follow it because that's the only way the student can register, because you must enter a certain number of courses that are pre-checked by the digital system because they don't trust the advisor, because the advisor, may come up with crazy ideas. And then once you follow the system, all the boxes become green and the student can literally register. Otherwise, they can't register.
All I
So-
can say in response is that it would be good if you could advise the student to take their time, maybe a course at a time,
Yeah.
come back and just learn what you want to learn. And there's no hurry to get a job.
I mean, we say it all the time, and of course,
Say
it
it, but
doesn't.
they don't buy it. They don't buy it.
Yeah, yeah.
Yeah, it's like New Orleans, it's one menu and 1,000 restaurants. That's really the analogy here, with all due respect to my quote unquote hometown, one menu, 1,000 restaurants. This is what's going down. They scheduled me 4:30 philosophy. I said, what kind of idiocy is this? First of all, everybody's exhausted at that time. They can't concentrate to begin with. Why not 9 in the morning, right? Or if you're going to put me in the evening, make it 6 o'clock. At least they can get a cup of coffee. At 4:30, everybody's burned out. Siesta time. Why do they have siesta? Or they close shops in Europe between. They're looking at me like I'm this madman from Mars when I start talking this way. I said, this is terrible pedagogy to schedule a philosophy class from 4:30 to 6. I said, secondly of all, I'm not going to get any athletes. I like working with the athletes. They're all in training at that time. They go to the gym. They have the games, the evening games. I went on and on and on. I still didn't win. I mean, these people are beyond. I don't care how good you could be reasoning like Rene Descartes and Leibniz in the room, and they just look at you like with these dumb eyes. No, we're right. We're right. We have it. This is what the computer tells us. This is what the algorithm decides. You'll get the most students this way, and we'll get them out, etc.
Oh, speaking of the algorithm, what's coming up next
Yeah,
is that
yeah.
the new generation of student, advisement
Right.
software can use predictive artificial intelligence
Yes.
to find students that are at risk, right? I mean, this is literally the language. And then what happens? Of course, they get an email, an automated email that's called an intervention. And then you get an email as the faculty. And then you're supposed to write the student like, hey, I'm a little bit concerned because the system told me that I should be
You're at
concerned
risk.
about you.
You're at risk.
So the system tells me because it can see what the human cannot, assuming that you don't know your students and you
It's
can't
unbelievable.
possibly, it's these cycles of prosthetics that are replacing more and more and more functions of basic human functioning. And the end is unclear, but it doesn't sound fun. It's stupidity. It's literally stupidity. It's a stupid way of using the cybernetic system.
Yeah. And when they get that risk letter, all they do is they try to cheat better. Where did I go wrong in my cheating? This is the whole thing. I didn't cut and paste well enough. What can I do? Those are my words, Professor. I said, can you define this word? You get a blank, right? It's your word, huh? Tell me about this word, right? What do you mean by ideation? What do you mean by it's unbelievable, right? Yeah, yeah. So good.
I like that. A probable
Yeah, it's good.
impossibility is to be. I
Yeah.
had a great teacher in music once. I studied with him briefly, but he was a avant-garde saxophone player, Joe Maneri, who was the father of the, violist Matt Maneri, free jazz musician. Joe Maneri was one of the giants of free jazz, and he interacted with some of the major figures in the 1960s briefly with Sam Rivers, I believe, and Coltrane, and he was from Brooklyn. Joe Maneri.
Hard slope.
Yeah, and Joe Maneri had his most profound saying about music and the arts was, he said you should always admire those who aim for the unreachable, right? I mean, he's basically paraphrasing Aristotle and Kant and everything. And he said that's really the essence of human life, is to be able to figure out for yourself to do that and to reach for something that is unreachable by you. But in doing so, you enrich your life and the life of those around you. And he said that every lesson, and so I think that's the political enemy that we're facing. I think that has been foreclosed, by the latest class of capital or whatever they are, techno-feudal lords.
Matt took his father's advice well. Matt is always trying to reach the impossible on the violin. He does some very interesting work, out there. Yeah, worth listening to. He had Plato with me. He was one of my students, many years ago. Yeah, great guy. Yeah, we'll go see him sometime, Arto. I get in.
Yeah.
He'd introduced Stanley to what's the name, the drummer Paul Motian, right?
Oh yeah.
Over to the table. We was playing at the Vanguard one night. A lot of fun. Yeah. But you see this in music too, that the music now, as you is very formulaic. It's very, very coded, in a sense. There's very little innovation, very little risk taking, etc. Some of the better musicians are great anthologizers. They're very good at playing the tradition and can do so with virtuosity. But the pushing of the limit is really not there anymore, right?
This is interesting, because speaking of music,
I mean, at least in jazz that I know.
So speaking of, Adorno and Heidegger and stuff, there was a great German conductor that lived and worked during the Nazis. He didn't leave Germany. His name was Wilhelm Furtwängler. He was, arguably the greatest conductor. He was the greatest conductor in Germany, but he was one of the great figures of the 20th century. And he didn't leave Germany because he said he didn't want to abandon German culture to barbarians, considered the Nazis, and had a shouting match with Hitler when they fired half of the musicians at the Berlin Philharmonic. And they didn't touch him though, because, he was a great musician, and Goebbels liked him, and anyways, so Furtwängler had this saying, because he only played classical music that was fully notated on paper, right? So music that's already formed, right? That doesn't really require much in terms of the imagination, et cetera. It's not originary creativity, we might say, right? But then you listen to Furtwängler's interpretations of already written music, of notated music, a Brahms symphony or something, and it's earth-shattering. It completely, you leave with the sensation of being deeply uncomfortable, because you've heard something in a completely new way that you thought you already knew, because you heard 1,000 times played the same way. So I read about Furtwängler's. He wrote a book on the philosophy of music, of course. And he said, it is an interesting idea. He said, a great piece of art, a great work of the human imagination is already perfect. It's already like well-formed object at the moment of its completion. It's already everything that the master artist wanted to express with their insight and their creativity is already solidified in the final score. Right. He said, we don't have access to that, because we're not on the level of the of the creative mind, right? We're derivative, thinkers. All we can do is try to imagine to the best of our ability what Brahms wrote or how he wanted that structure to be interpreted. And if we can get close to that, we would have accomplished our jobs, right? And it's like I was listening to this and I was like, okay, well, how does this sound? Well, the oral impact of a Furtwängler interpretation of Brahms Symphony No. 1, for example, that you can listen to on YouTube, is unbelievable. It's similar to what Michael was saying with Glenn Gould's interpretation of the already existing musical object, or whatever. So there is definitely possibility for the creative to be active in any stage of creation, whether you're interpreting something or whether you're actually writing the music, or you're interpreting Einstein's results and trying to work with them. So in other words, the creative is still there, but the question is having the practice to use our minds and imaginations, rather than externalizing it and giving it away. It's interesting.
Yeah, interesting. Yeah. By the way, I just wanted to read you something. I was reading Ronowitz. I got this because I remember the conversation we had. It's a piece called Setting the Record Straight, Zionism from the Standpoint of Its Jewish Critics, which of course is a play on Edward Said's famous piece, Zionism from the Standpoint of Its Victims. And anyway, he goes back to Buber and Einstein. Buber and Einstein, professed Zionists, issued dire warnings that a radical departure from the values of humanism and the concept of the community of nations, statements that echo Arendt's repudiation of ethnic tribalism, would condemn the new state of Israel to isolation and prevent the creation of what Einstein terms a common future for two great Semitic people. This should be out there as part of the conversation right now. Yeah. Okay. Two great Semitic people, the common future. And 48 minces no words, Einstein, in his condemnation of the Jewish right for its attack on Arab villages, terrorist acts, and bleak nationalist visions. Yeah, etc. So very, very interesting. You can use no lesser a mind than Albert Einstein to call for ultimately the real ceasefire. That should be out there. Yeah, in so many ways. Yeah. I mean, not that it's going to make a difference. I'm not, a blind dreamer, and but at the same time, it really gives you an idea of what's happening in 48. It's Stanley Aronowitz in a piece called "Setting the Record Straight: Zionism from the Standpoint of Its Jewish Critics." It's in Logos. You can get it online. Logos 3.3, summer of 2004. It's a very, very solid piece. I forgot how good this is. Sometimes Stanley amazes me in retrospect. I always read stuff when it was in process, and then when it would hit the book and have discussions. But it really stands this test of time. I reread this very well. It's like 20 years ago, but it's really on point. Yeah.
Can it be sent to us, Michael, or do we have to?
I'll see if I can do it, but all you have to do is Google Aronowitz Logos 3.3 summer 2004. But yes, I'll try to. Again, I'm not like Arto. I'm not good with these machines. I need courses. Yeah, I'm just kidding.
I'm trying to be less. I'm starting to write
yeah,
more.
He's going back to his beautiful. He has a beautiful fountain pen collection. Arto has two fetishes: fountain pens and pipes.
And my grandfather's
his grandfather's
pocket watch, which I find very liberating to be using too.
Yeah. We went to the Penn Hospital together. I remember that was a lot of fun down by LaGuardia. By the BMCC.
Yeah.
On what's the name of that street? Oh God, why am I blocking on it? The one that goes east-west. Well, anyway, by
For all those children without pencils at hand, could you give us one more time the website to get Stanley's?
Logos is the name of the publication.
Logos.
Logos.
Mm-hmm.
It's an online journal.
Mm-hmm.
And the issue is 3.3.
Okay.
Summer 2004.
Summer 2004.
Yeah, Aronowitz, Setting the Record Straight. colon. Only Stanley would write that. I'm going to set the record straight. Zionism from the standpoint of its Jewish critics.
I miss him
very
all the
good.
time, Michael. You know that.
Yeah, I do too, of course. Yes, I know. I miss him there. Thank you, Patrick. Thank you for the great interventions tonight. Thank you so much. Yeah.
I'm going to post the article in the chat.
Okay. Okay, thanks. You got it already,
I think
huh?
I found it.
Okay. Yes.
So
That's it.
it should be
got
in
it.
there. Yeah.
Yeah. I'll tell you if it's the right one.
Fresh.
You can see, yeah, Cornell West, Stephen Eric John Stanley Aronowitz, Zionism and its Jewish critics. It's a very beautiful thing on remembering Sasha Hamid too, filmmaker on film and music. Very, very good pieces. This is a pretty first rate, yeah. And Resurrecting Empire by Khalidi, who is the Columbia professor who wrote a very good book called 100 Years of Palestine, History of Palestine, 100 years, right? Yeah.
Okay, but while we're on it, Michael and Arto, I
Yeah.
have it on my screen,
Yeah.
but I'm surrounded by all kinds of symbols. How do I save that to my computer without messing things up? There are thousands of, how do I hit save?
You mean the article by Aronowitz?
Yeah, yeah, logos. It's there. It's beautiful on my screen.
I
But there are all
think
kinds of new symbols,
Just
conversation.
go up to file, bring up the article, even I know this, and then go to file and put save as.
well,
No,
do you have if you okay, so if you go scroll all the way down on
Yeah.
Stanley's article, all the way down where it
Okay.
says printer friendly format. Do you see that?
no, I'm looking at, okay.
At the
this-
bottom of the
hey,
page. Yeah.
It says, okay, there's nothing, then there's drop, Outlook, Microsoft 365, games, there's all this stuff along the sides. Okay,
Well, you're not on the window then. You're not on the
Okay. no,
if
wait,
you
okay, I'll go up big, but now I can't see you.
Well, you have a printer friendly thing in front of you. I just did it, right? Yeah.
Oh, sure.
It's at the bottom.